The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is a truly monumental piece of art. From a physics system that feels real and has genuine consequence to a chemistry system that just screams ingenuity, the way you as a player interact with the environment is genuine and innovative. Your ability to spot something in the distance and just go there is unmatched in any other game that I can think of. The climbing mechanics feel balanced and well developed to the point that even the slightest change in gradient will affect that stamina consumption. You can't deny the game is artistically innovative and technically incredible, and it will go down in the history books as one of the best games of all time. But I have an issue. In fact, I've got several issues, and I just don't think that the Breath of the Wild is a good Legend of Zelda game. And in building this series, I found more and more issues with it. Hi, my name is Avalon. This is my first episode of the series, and I want to set a general structure to the episodes that will follow. I want to be clear that this game is amazing. It just doesn't meet the expectations set by its predecessors. Over the course of this series, I'll talk about the story, the world, the music, the gameplay, and a variety of other topics, so be very prepared to hear the words "the scope was too big" a whole bunch. However, to start, I'd like to invite you into conversation about the most important thing for any video game: how it feels to play. Before I get into it, Gamefeel is very subjective, and although some videos in this series will be backed by facts and stats, this is very much about opinion and feeling, and because of that, I'm very open to discussion around it, so please add your comments down below. So in other videos, both on my channel, off my channel, other people's channels, I've talked about Metroidvanias. They're a game that has like a key and lock system that's disguised behind items and abilities. Think Hollow Knight most recently, or of course Metroid Dread since it's released and from the namesake. I've argued whether 3D Metroidvanias are valid, I think they are, and whether Legend of Zelda is a Metroidvania. Ultimately, I think it is. But irrelevant to whether you agree with me on that or not, you must agree that the core philosophies of the series have been the dungeons, the puzzles, and the bosses, and all three of these fit into the item collection and game growth that this series has been built on. This is something Breath of the Wild sorely misses out on. Taking the 4 dungeons as they are, the Divine Beasts, you gain no abilities and items during the dungeons. Yes, I know you gain new powers after you beat each one, but because that's after the dungeon has been cleared, you can't have puzzles built around it, and because of how open the game is, future dungeons can't consider that power either. Heck, even the final dungeon can't consider them, since you can start there if you want. The only powers or items considered for the game are those acquired on the Great Plateau. So the reason that I brought up Metroidvanias and item gated progression is that every single Legend of Zelda game has this concept. Even Breath of the Wild uses the glider to lock you into a starting area. But the core difference between Metroidvanias, other Zelda games, and Breath of the Wild is that once you pass that gate, once you prove you have the item, you're tested with it. Whether it's in combat, exploration, puzzles, you're provided with a challenge for your new item. Breath of the Wild really lacks that challenge. The runes are given to you before their shrines begin, so you can't explore the shrines without them. The glider is given to you before the majority of the game begins, and while some shrines do test these abilities, the core gameplay does not change as you play. Every part of the world is built expecting you to have the 4 base runes and the glider, but every part of the world is built assuming that you haven't mastered them. There is nothing you have to come back to in the future, no secret you have to find later, unless you count the great fairies begging for rupees that you may not have, but there's no aha moment to collecting money. So you're presented with this vast world, nothing gated away from you, no points you must log in your memory to return to with a new power. Everything you can't complete is either you're unable to work it out at the moment as a player, or you need more rupees. And now this isn't a bad thing inherently, and to my earlier point, I'm not arguing that Breath of the Wild is a bad game, but Hyrule, Termina, and the numerous other worlds Links have explored have always had areas that you can't reach, heart pieces that you can't quite collect and have to come back to. The world unlocks as you get stronger, and you understand the world in new ways as your skill set grows, and this is something that is just missing from Breath of the Wild. Overworld exploration aside, the dungeons are always a highlight of the Zelda world. We all know the story. The world's in danger, some evil dude did it, the evil dude protects their weak points with the bosses, we overcome the bosses, we collect the weapon against the evil, and then we succeed. Hyrule saved. Hooray. And Breath of the Wild tries to achieve this with the same cheap nostalgia baiting Last Skywalker did when it brought back Palpatine. The dungeons are all the same. I've spoken about this before, and I will cover this in more detail during this series, but if I was to say to you, you move the parts of the dungeon to make minor changes, activate 5 points, and then fight a big malice at the end. Which dungeon am I talking about? Alright, how if I was to say the boss is purple and black with a blue weak point, the walls are like a dusty grey, and you explore both inside and outside the beast. I appreciate I'm taking this argument to its extreme point, but this is true for all dungeons in Breath of the Wild. They've been built without passion, without theming, and the bosses are not linked to them at all. There is an exception to this in Varnaboris, however this beast becomes cheap when it's repeated throughout the whole game. The bosses are there because they knew they had to make something similar to Zelda games. They knew marketing would fail if they couldn't talk about dungeons and bosses, so they almost forced them into this game. And yes, they did a really incredible job linking them into the story, and yes, it makes sense that there would be protectors of the Divine Beast, but why are they all the same? Find any other Zelda game where the same mechanic is the primary mechanic of all the dungeons. Find any other Zelda game that uses the same boss in every dungeon. Heck, I'd be surprised if you could find a Zelda game where the same color scheme is used throughout, let alone artistic theming. And all of this accumulates into dungeons that just aren't satisfying to complete after the first one, a game world that doesn't change after beating them, and a counterintuitive reward of weakening the final boss. To be clear, I'm not saying there's no positive to the dungeons. As I mentioned earlier, Varnaboris was an exception to the repeated design choice, and the DLC did add a very unique dungeon. But the DLC isn't the base game, so I'm not including it in this video. Hyrule Castle, however, is a well-designed dungeon that suits the gameplay, the world, and the Legend of Zelda series as a whole. Now, I have a whole video to talk about this planned, and Hyrule Castle deserves endless praise for its design, hidden areas, and how it fits in with the open structure of the game. My point is they don't feel like dungeons from a Zelda game. Not gaining a new ability or item midway through creates no flow or progression through the dungeon. Not having a unique theme creates a feeling of repetition, and not having a unique boss is just boring. Tackling the dungeons in any order is not part of the game that feels off for a Legend of Zelda game. The part that feels off is the lack of progression during and after these dungeons. There's no effect on the world as a whole, no new exploration, no new areas, and even if there was, what would be the point? The lack of item permanence means that what you find is either rupees or a sword that's going to break fairly soon, or a piece of armor that you'd likely not use over the combat armor or weather protective gears. Even then, those armor pieces don't do anything new, excluding the Zora armor, which is genuinely awesome and a whole different point. The overworld progression just doesn't exist. Dungeon-based progression doesn't exist. There's no feeling of overcoming a great evil, and even when you do, you don't need the weapon of evil's bane. You don't even need the Master Sword or the Force Sword or whatever sword is supposed to be required to defeat the evil corrupting the land. And yes, I know about silver arrows versus light arrows, I get that, but the sword has always been something that's required, with two examples being the original where the sword is your call to action, or A Link to the Past where the sword is required to break the seal to get to Aghanim and then the Dark World. This game isn't a quest, it's an exploration. It's not some great epic adventure, it's a collection of small game loops dotted around a huge map. The way you interact with the world is always the same, the way you fight enemies never changes, and the way you progress will never have value once you can kill the final boss in the first hour of game time. Breath of the Wild is a masterpiece in the world of video games, but it doesn't belong in a series that has for so long relied on item-based progression. I know Breath of the Wild aimed to go back to the roots of the game, to focus on what The Legend of Zelda was supposed to be, but go back to that first game. The items were key to progression even with the technical limitations. The raft was needed for level 4, the recorder opens the path to level 7 and deals with Dig Dogger, even the candle burns down trees to find secrets. These games are not in the same category. The last thing I want to briefly touch on is the NPCs and quests. Now, I have a lot to say about these in multiple upcoming videos, but excluding Tarry Town, there's no major effect on the world at all. All they tend to do is either give you rupees or lead to a shrine. The quest rewards are exactly the same, rupees or shrines, and rupees being a currency doesn't exactly fill you with excitement. Shrines don't exactly bring excitement either. They're just like the dungeons, they all look the same, and many of the quest shrines are simply blessing shrines, which may as well not exist. I'm not saying that every quest in every game has to be perfect or will be perfect, especially in a game as big as Breath of the Wild, but to have so many forgettable quest lines and NPCs is just disappointing for this series. The other primary side content is of course the shrines. Now 120 just sounds amazing until you realise that 29 are blessing shrines, 20 are repeated test of strengths, 5 use the motion controls, and suddenly you're left with 66 shrines, which include repeated and underdeveloped concepts. Only a handful are actually memorable, such as carrying the blue fire, and I will defend that shrine to the end of the day. A whole load of them use cannons or seesaws, and you're ultimately left with like a 1 in 6 chance to get a shrine with a good concept that you haven't seen before. And let's not even get started on the repetition of Korok puzzles. The side content looks impressive numerically, but when there's no value behind the numbers, it just falls short, and I can't wait to discuss shrines in more detail. So thank you for listening to this, and like I said, Gamefeel is a really subjective thing, and I wanted this to be more like an introduction video, and I couldn't find a topic that was short enough to condense into one video alongside the introduction to the series. So I picked Gamefeel, and like I said, it's a very subjective thing, so if you do feel differently, I'd love to discuss it further with you. Also, this was the first video, so there'll be several links to like future videos, but this won't really be the case moving forward. I plan to try and keep each video contained within its own category. As you can work out, there's a lot to discuss here, so this series will probably grow for quite a long time, and if there's things that you feel that we should cover, either positive or negative, then let me know, because I want to have this discussion. And despite the negative tone to this, there will be some positive videos in this series, because there are some really good things in this game. But with that said, I have been Avalon, and I'll see you guys next time.